Hey everyone. So after reviewing your part one of your papers as well as lab two, where you were asked to design a short survey, I realized that a lot of people are still struggling with the concepts of identifying a clear research question, then translating that into a testable hypothesis that is phrased as a statement with a clear cause and effect, as well as being a directional hypothesis, and then even identifying what is the causal construct, what's the outcome construct, and then designing survey questions that are narrowly focused to measure those things. So I put together this short presentation hoping that it will help you, because the main thing that I'm concerned about is for your writing assignment number 2. It's really important because a big part of that section of the paper is having a good methodology where you can identify all of these key things. And then also, as your appendix, you need to attach a survey. So as I'm working to wrap up the gradings and posting feedback on lab 2 and writing assignment 1, I wanted to get this out to the entire class so that even as you're waiting for scores to come in, it doesn't hold you up from making sure that writing assignment number 2 turns out looking as good as possible. So let's go ahead and jump into these things. So one of the key things we want to make sure about is when you're coming up with a research question, and I'm looking through your papers, you all have great topics, but some of you are trying to bite off a little bit more than you can chew for the level of what we're doing for this class. What I need right now is to make sure, can you clearly articulate a very clear-cut research question? So what makes a good research question? Well, first of all, it's got to be a question. It's not a statement, it's a question. And then number 2, we want to make sure that when we're designing a good research question, that even within that research question, the reader has a pretty good idea of what appears to be the cause and what's the effect, and not trying to make it too convoluted. So take a look at these 5 research questions and just try to get an idea and try to guess which of the following are clear and straightforward. So I will shut up. I will allow you to read through them. You can pause or whatever, however you're viewing this. And then on the next slide, we'll go through and take a look at which ones are good and which ones are bad and why. Okay, so hopefully you either had the PowerPoint or paused the presentation, took a chance to read through each one of those research questions. And now on this slide, you'll notice that of the 5 research or the 5 statements and or questions I have here, 3 of them have been blocked out as being bad. They are not clear research questions. So let's take a look at why. Let's go through all these things 1 through 5. Number 1, the historical presence of a patriarchal society in America has led to the oppression of women. That is not a research question. It's a statement. As you can see, it doesn't even end with a question mark. So if I wanted to work on that topic, I'd have to figure out a way to re-articulate my statement and turn it into a testable research or a question of some sort. And even if it's as simple as like, has the presence of patriotism or patriarchal society in America led to the oppression of women, right? You could start with that. Number two, I have not blocked out. Why didn't I block it out? Because this one's pretty clear. I'm not saying these are great research questions, but it's clear with a clearly identifiable cause and outcome. Does exposure to domestic violence in the home impact the psychological development of children? It's stated as a question, and when you read through it, you'll notice there's a clear cause and effect. Exposure to domestic violence as a cause, psychological development of the children as an outcome. Let's look at number 3. Number 3, are children who play violent video games more likely to engage in aggressive deviant behavior than children who don't play violent video games? Once again, it turns out to be a clear-cut question. It's in a question format, and if we look through there, we're trying to figure out, well, what's the cause and the effect? The cause comes down to be the presence of experiencing violent video games, and then the outcome is the aggressive deviant behavior. And so we can sort of figure those out. Number 4, why has the rate of homelessness increased in Southern California over the past decade? Is it a question? Yes. Is it pretty clear? Yes. But as far as a research question, it's too vague Why? Because it starts with why. It doesn't give some sort of potential reason for it. All it has is the rate of homelessness increasing. It has an outcome, but it doesn't have a cause. And in good research, I mean, so this may be a good starting point for somebody who's just getting into a study, but before they turn into a research question, you've got to have some sort of clear-cut causal construct in there, not just an outcome and an open-ended front end to it. And then number 5, would you agree that law enforcement officers who have received a college education are more likely to enforce the law effectively without excessive use of force? Here, this sounds like an opinion-based survey question. This is not a good research question that you would set up for an actual scientific study. So within that, even though, and with number 5, you'll see on the next slide, we're going to take number 5 and we're going to tweak it a little bit to make it into a better, clear-cut research question with a clear cause and a clear effect. So let's take a look at the 2 that are not blocked out, and then number 5 slightly reworded. So when we look at these, you'll notice now that we've got 1 and 2, we've already talked about these ones. They are written in question format, and as you read through them, you should be able to identify a clear cause and a clear effect or clear outcome. You'll notice for number 3, what I did is I took 5 from the previous page, number 5 from the previous page, and I've changed it, and I've just reworded it a little bit to make it a little bit clearer about, so that it's in a testable research question with a clear cause and effect. Are college-educated law enforcement officers more likely to enforce the law effectively without excessive use of force? So here, the way that this one's phrased is it's just asking in a general sense, and we see a clear cause. The cause would be level of education, right? We're not just going to focus on college-educated law enforcement officers. We would also want to make sure that we've got a variety, because then if you don't have variability in your study, then you're not going to be able to, once you get to data analysis and statistics, be able to prove or show an association between 2, as the word implies, variables. Okay, so level of education in number 3 becomes our cause, and then the outcome would be the ability to enforcement of the law, or effective law enforcement, something like that, right? Kind of that back end use of it. All right, so let's take a look a little bit deeper. So now we get a better idea. Hopefully this helps you to get a somewhat better idea of like, how do we articulate a clear research question? The next step in any good research study is we need to get a testable hypothesis. So let's move on to the next. All right, so for this one, I took one of the research questions from before, and we're going to continue working with it over the next few slides as an example. So the question has been established. So does exposure to domestic violence in the home impact the psychological development of children? All right. So what makes a testable hypothesis? Well, first of all, a testable hypothesis has to be a statement. A hypothesis is not a question. There should not be a question mark at the end of a hypothesis. A hypothesis also should still clearly be able to show, a reader should be able to understand the cause and the effect. And then more importantly, one of the last things that makes a good hypothesis is there's got to be sort of a directional prediction within that hypothesis. So let's take a look, and I'm going to do the same thing we did before. I'm going to have you look at these 2 hypotheses and see which one is the better hypothesis. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about which one it is and why it is. So take a look, and then I'll see you on the next slide. So welcome back to the hypothesis stuff. So you'll notice here what I have blocked out is I have gotten rid of number 2. So why did I choose number 1? Well, number 1, remember, a hypothesis should be a clear statement. It should clearly, the reader should be able to clearly identify the cause and the effect. And finally, you should be able to see some sort of directional prediction in that hypothesis. So our original research question was, does exposure to domestic violence in the home impact the psychological development of children? We already have the idea that the cause here is exposure to domestic violence. The outcome or the effect is psychological development. Does that exposure impact psychological development? So why did I choose number one? Well, let's look at number one. First of all, it is a statement. Children who have been exposed to domestic violence are more likely to have negative psychological development issues. Okay, is it a statement? Yes. By reading that, can we still get a pretty clear-cut idea of what the cause is and what the outcome or effect is? I think so. Children who have been exposed to domestic violence, that is our cause, are more likely to have negative psychological development issues. Psychological development is our outcome. Finally, to make it a good hypothesis, does it have a clear-cut directional prediction about the connection or association between these two constructs? And sure enough, it does, right? It says children who have been exposed, and the key phrase here, are more likely, right? That's that predictional component that a hypothesis must have. Number two, why did I cross out number two? Well, it says exposure to domestic violence may have an impact on the psychological development of a child. All right, fair enough. It's a statement. It has clearly identified that the exposure to domestic violence is sort of the cause. It has an idea about impacting the psychological development as our outcome or our effect, but there's no predictional statement here, right? And in some way that's kind of waffling. It says, oh, it may have, and it may have an impact. Well, a good impact, a negative impact, a big impact, a little impact, right? There's no sort of, you've got to have, when you put together your hypothesis, you've got to be somewhat, you're taking a gamble, right? You got to pick. You got to say, I bet this is going to happen. And that's kind of what a good testable hypothesis should do. So now that we've got our research question, we've got a hypothesis, number one on this slide that we're going to work with, what is our next step? Let's make sure that we understand what the key causal construct is, as well as the key outcome construct. So let's move ahead. In identifying the key causal construct, the key thing that we want to say is a construct should not be a sentence. It shouldn't be a question. It shouldn't be a statement. A construct should be a concept, an idea. So if you're using, and a lot of the feedback that I'm giving on Lab 2 is, when I say what's the key causal construct or key outcome construct, if you're giving me a sentence, that's wrong. There's no way that can be. And you don't, also when identifying your causal construct, you don't want to include both your cause and your effect. Now we're starting to get that sort of like that tunnel vision. We're starting to narrow things down, because that's what we're going to do when we get to our survey. Our survey is going to be very precise in how the questions are designed and what constructs they're supposed to measure. So our hypothesis was children who have been exposed to domestic violence are more likely to have negative psychological development issues. And I've already given a hint about the cause and the outcome on previous slides, but when looking at that, think about how you would break it down to, I say, okay, how do I identify the key causal construct using a very concise sort of phrase or word? Usually I say if your construct takes longer than 4 words to identify, it's too much. Like 1 to 4 words is a construct. Anything longer, something's wrong. Okay, so look at these 3 examples and figure out which one do you think is the key causal construct. So take a moment, pause it if you like, and then move on to the next slide to figure out which one would be correct. For the key causal construct, you'll notice that I have gotten rid of choices 1 and 3. Why? Well, number 3, I'm kind of going out of order, but number 3, why is that the problem? Because that is a construct. I will agree with that, but it's the outcome. It's the endogenous construct. It's the effect. It's, number 2 is the one I chose. You'll notice 4 words, a simple phrase, exposure to domestic violence, period. And you could even said domestic violence exposure and gotten rid of a word, right? A nice, concise phrase that gives you an idea of a concept, an abstract concept, which in its heart is a construct. Why did I get rid of number 1? Well, number 1 says children having development issues due to domestic violence. This right here is just another way of first of all, it's wordy. 2, it's incorporating both the cause and the effect. and it's just way too much going on, right? So as you're identifying a construct, the focus should be narrow. In some ways, and I think a lot of you looking through your work, you're doing great and you're trying to go deeper, but when it comes to this, now you're trying to you want the bare bones, strip away the fat when you're starting to take a research question, turn it into a hypothesis, and then as you start this process of operationalization and identifying your constructs, you're starting to strip away the parts, right? So it's no longer just an engine, which was your starting point with all sort of things. Now you've got, you've got a radiator, you've got a carburetor, you've got the pieces. You start thinking about the pieces when you think about the construct. So you keep it simple and focused. When identifying the key outcome construct, and this kind of follows exactly from the previous slides, it's going to be, once again, the same idea, 1 to 4 words, a very specific term, phrase, a concept that we're trying to capture from it. So now when we look at this slide, we've gone from, like I sort of used with the previous slide, the entire engine, the question, all the way down to the component parts. And that is the key causal construct, the key outcome construct. I didn't go into demographics or control constructs for this particular lecture just because I wanted to keep it simple and keep it somewhat short. So we had our question, does exposure to domestic violence in the home impact the psychological development of children? We changed that research question into a testable hypothesis. Children who have been exposed to domestic violence are more likely to have negative psychological development issues. Then we figure out, okay, what are the constructs that we need to operationalize, at least our key constructs? Our cause is exposure to domestic violence. Our outcome or effect is psychological development. And you'll notice for psychological development, I don't say negative or positive, no. Because even with the domestic violence stuff, we're going to measure, once again, the word variable. We want all spectrums. So when we start thinking about in the next step of operationalizing these constructs, looking at exposure to domestic violence, I want to make sure my questions allow for people who have been exposed to domestic violence, those who have not been exposed to domestic violence, and those who may have seen a little bit of it. Same thing with my key outcome, psychological development. I want to make sure I write my questions in a manner where I capture all levels from good to bad. So let's move on to the next. So imagine we've got these survey questions. So we have our hypothesis. Children who have been exposed to domestic violence are more likely to have negative psychological development issues. And then here, what I've done is I've given you 5 possible questions that somebody says I would like to include on my survey. Now, I'm not saying these are the greatest questions, and I don't care if we're not going to worry about closed-ended, open-ended right now. I just want to make sure the key thing here is your survey questions. This is the point at which you were finally operationalizing those pieces of your engine, those components of your engine, your causal and your outcome, and then potentially demographic or control constructs. Very, very focused. So when thinking about good questions, a good question is asking only about one single construct. That I cannot stress enough. Do not have a question that includes both constructs in it. Only one construct at a time. So if my hypothesis is that children who have been exposed to domestic violence are more likely to have negative psychological development issues, then I need to have some questions that ask about exposure to domestic violence, period. I also need to have some questions that ask about their level of psychological development, period. You'll notice I never, in both of those examples, ever said that there should be a question that asks about whether they think that exposure has impacted their psychological development. No. As a researcher, I don't want my subjects' opinions about my overall research question. I'm the boss. Me and my staff, we are the ones who are going to collect the data, and we are going to scientifically and statistically show whether or not there is a statistical association between the cause and the effect. I'm not going to ask the people who volunteer to take my survey, do you think there's an association between these two things? No, it's not an opinion survey. So keep that in mind. It should be narrowly focused. So take a look at these 5 examples, figure out Are they narrowly focused and only ask about one construct? If so, they are going to be deemed good. If not, they're going to be deemed bad. And then also think about which construct are they operationalizing, the cause or the outcome. So I'll take a look. Feel free to pause it. The next slide will do the same thing we've done before. All right. So finally, we have some survey questions. You'll notice out of questions 1 through 5, only 3 of them made the cut. 2, 3, and 5 we would keep. 1 and 4 are bad questions. Why is number 1 a bad question? Okay. And remember, a survey question should be very narrowly focused, asking about one construct and one construct only. So number 1, has witnessing domestic violence in your home impacted your ability to find and keep friends? Okay. Well, it's asking about domestic violence. But it's sort of assuming, once again, it's sort of biased and one-sided. It's assuming that they've experienced violence, and we don't know that from our sample. And then it's also bringing in some ideas about psychological development, and that's sort of like their ability to find and keep friends. So number 1's bad. It's asking sort of in a leading manner. It's sort of assuming that it's not getting the full range of witnessing or not witnessing domestic violence. And it's asking about more than one construct. So number 1 is gone. Number 4, that's the other one I crossed out. So does it make you feel depressed when you see your parents fight? Similar idea. It's sort of leading and assuming that these individuals, first of all, are experiencing domestic violence. And also, it brings in both constructs, depression, which is related to psychological development, as well as the seeing parents fight, which is that idea of experiencing domestic violence. It is an opinion question. 1 and 4 are the worst types of questions you want if you want a very pointed, research-heavy, valid survey. 2, 3, and 5. Okay. So 2, 3, and 5, I say we keep these. Now, am I saying that they're great questions? Not necessarily. But they get at the point of what we want to be able to do right now. So number 2 and 3, I argue, are measuring our dependent variable, right? That is how we operationalize our endogenous or outcome construct. So you may recall our outcome construct was psychological development. So number 2, how often do you feel confident in social settings? That is sort of getting at somebody's level of psychological development, right? If they say they feel confident, that's a good thing. That's good psychological development. But it also allows for a range of responses that I can measure negative and positive psychological development. You'll also notice in number 2, I never mention anything about domestic violence, and that is the most important part. If I'm measuring my dependent variable, which is psychological development, then I only want to target that, and I want to have the question be able to have a range of responses. Same idea with number 3. Do you have trouble making friends? Right? So we could argue that this idea of trouble making friends may also be an indicator. Remember, that's what the operationalization is, an indicator of the level of psychological development. Do you have trouble making friends? Once again, it allows for yes, I do, no, I don't, sometimes, or whatever, a range of responses targeting an indicator of that underlying construct or psychological development, and there is absolutely no mention at all of our causal construct, which was domestic violence. Finally, number 5, this is the one that I would argue becomes an independent variable question, which is operationalizing our causal construct. So hopefully, it should only be measuring exposure to domestic violence. And we ask, have you ever seen your father hit your mother? Okay. Once again, it allows for a full variety of responses from yes, I have, no, I haven't, once or twice, or whatever, right? It allows for a range of responses. That's the variability part of variable. And it's only focusing on an indicator of exposure to domestic violence. So it's not necessarily saying, have you ever witnessed domestic violence? That's a little too broad, right? Because a kid, especially if you're asking this to a young population, they may not even really understand, well, what is domestic violence? But you're looking for these indicators, and that's what makes a good survey question. That's why we operationalize effectively, is by not necessarily using the names of our constructs all the time, but looking for terms and indicators that represent those larger abstract ideas. So hopefully this will help you out as you work forward and finish up writing assignment number 2, as well as designing your survey. I'll continue to get all the other grades updated as soon as possible, and I hope you have a good weekend.